Yes, I'll see you tomorrow morning. Okay. So we've been working our way through the Pentateuch, which was the first 5 books of the Bible, and that ended with Deuteronomy. And then Joshua is the book of the Bible that transitions from Moses' leadership onward into the Promised Land. So Joshua did well. He was faithful. And as long as everyone who was alive when Joshua taught was alive, things went well. But over the generations that come, Israel is going to drift farther and farther away from what God intended for them. And so the book of Judges has some of the highest highs and the lowest lows in the Bible in terms of people's walk with God. So we're going to encounter incredible grace and incredible wrath. And just know that it's quite a journey. So we're going to start with chapter 1, verse 1. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord which tribe should go first to attack the Canaanites. And the Lord answered, Judah, for I have given them victory over the land. So again, during Joshua's leadership, they lived peacefully in the land, but they never finished clearing it out. They never finished really marking their boundaries. And some tribes decided, well, that's too hard. We'll settle over here instead. So now that Joshua has died, good morning. We had another person. There we go. So now that Joshua has died, they're finally getting back to going and attempting to take over the land fully. So the men of Judah said to the relatives from the tribe of Simeon, join with us to fight against the Canaanites living in the territory allotted to us. Then we will help you conquer your territory. So the men of Simeon went out with Judah. When the men of Judah attacked, the Lord gave them victory over the Canaanites and the Perizzites, and they killed 10,000 enemy warriors in the town of Bezek. While at Bezek, they encountered King Adoni-Bezek and fought against him, and the Canaanites and the Perizzites were defeated. Adoni-Bezek escaped, but the Israelites soon captured him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. Ew. Again, not everything we read is what God tells them to do. Sometimes people make choices. After a long day of battle, they were decided that this is how they would cripple the king. They don't kill him, they cripple him. So verse 7, Adoni-Bezek said, I once had 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off, eating scraps from under my table. Now God has paid me back for what I did to them. Oh, so now we hear it's not just that they make this decision based on their own whim, but in fact, they are taking vengeance for what Adoni-Bezek has done. And he honors that this is God paying him back. So they took him to Jerusalem and he died there. So presumably he lived the rest of his natural life in Jerusalem, a captive. Good morning. We're in Judges chapter 1. And all righty. So they've just taken over from Adoni-Bezek. We're in chapter 1, verse 11. And now they're going to go on. Nope, we're not in verse 11. We're in verse 8. So the men of Judah attacked Jerusalem and captured it, killing all its people and setting the city on fire. Then they went down to fight the Canaanites living in the hill country, the Negev, and the western foothills. So for those of you who don't know much about planning a war or fighting a battle, the old saying goes, the city on a hill is the hardest to take. And that's why they hadn't yet captured and taken over Jerusalem, because it was going to be too hard. So they spent some time building up their strength, getting ready, and now they feel confident. And they start by taking over Jerusalem, because if the fortress falls, then the outlying territories are much easier. So they've taken over Jerusalem, and then they go down to fight in the hill country and the western foothills. And Judah marches against the Canaanites in Hebron formerly called Kiriath Arba, defeating the forces of Sheshai, Ahaman, and Talmai. From there, they went to fight against the people living in the town of Debir, formerly called Kiriath Sephir. One of the annoying things for us in the Bible, when we come especially to the Old Testament, is these places that all have 10 or 15 names and trying to keep them straight. Where was this actually, and why did the name change? Think about it this way. For any of you who lived a long time in a particular town, you probably had oh, well, that's the old Jones place. Now, the Joneses hadn't lived there in 30 years, but everybody still called it the Jones place. The Bible is similar. The names of the towns are based on family groups and heritage or big events that happen. And every time you get a new big event, you give it a new name. And it all flows along. So again, they have gone out to fight. They're taking over. And then we see one of the first instances where they begin to go awry. Verse 12. Caleb says, I will give my daughter Aksa in marriage to the one who attacks and captures Kiriath Sephir. Othniel, the son of Caleb's younger brother, Kenaz, was the one who conquered it, so Aksa became Othniel's wife. So we see a woman traded for victory. This is not anything new to us as information. This happens all the time. Still today, you have political alliances formed. You have the preservation of capital and inheritance with our marital choices. But this is not necessarily part of God's plan. This is just how they decide in their human wisdom to work it out. So in verse 14, when Aksa married Othniel, she urges him to ask her father for a field. As she got down off her donkey, Caleb asked her, what's the matter? And she says, let me have another gift. You have already given me the land in the Negev. Now please give me springs of water too. So Caleb gave her the upper and lower springs. Again, she's like, if I got to spend the rest of my life married to you and I didn't pick you, you better give me something for it. And so she gets upper and lower springs. Good for her. Verse 16, when the tribe of Judah left Jericho, the city of palms, the Kenites, who were descendants of Moses' father-in-law, traveled with them into the wilderness of Judah, and they settled among the people there near the town of Arad and the Negev. Then Judah joined with Simeon to fight against the Canaanites living in Zaphath, and they completely destroyed the town. So the town was named Hormah. This is a Hebrew term, and it means destruction. So the Hebrew town is named for being destroyed. In addition, Judah captured the towns of Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron, along with their surrounding territories. Now, some of you may be thinking, Gaza, that sounds familiar, the Gaza Strip. Yes, Israelites and Palestinians and various other tribes are still fighting over this land today. And who does it rightfully belong to based on which portion of history people owned it? And so if you read this portion of the Bible where, again, God urges them to kill everybody who isn't an Israelite who lives there, and you think, God, that's terrible. That's awful. Why would God want that or do that? Remember, God's perspective is eternal. Therefore, God knows, A, that they're not going to do it. But B, God also knows that this failure to do that is going to set them up for thousands and thousands and thousands of years of war and strife and killing. So if they had killed a whole bunch of people right at the first and been successful, would fewer have people died long term, and would there have been less strife? I'm inclined to believe so, because again, this was God's recommendation. They just failed to follow it. Verse 19, the Lord was filled with the people of Judah, and they took possession of the hill country. But they failed to drive the people out living in the plains who had iron chariots. This is going to be one of those things that begins to set the Israelites on the wrong path, because remember in Deuteronomy, they were commanded not to keep a standing army. They were commanded not to have charioteers, not to have iron chariots. Well, they're going to do that because they're going to remember, well, the people who had the iron chariots were too strong for us, so we must need them too. Verse 20, the town of Hebron was given to Caleb as Moses had promised. And Caleb drove out the people living there who were descendants of the 3 sons of Anak. Wait a minute. Didn't we just read a few verses back that they completely destroyed this town? Wouldn't that have meant they killed everyone? And now we're reading that Caleb drives the people who were living there out. Again, the way Judges is written uses some hyperbolic, grandiose statements, like they completely annihilated everyone. They completely destroyed everyone. And then a few verses later, we read more of the nuanced truth that, well, they did destroy the town and they drove the people out. Verse 21, the tribe of Benjamin, however, failed to drive out the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. So to this day, the Jebusites live in Jerusalem among the people of Benjamin. Again, this all begins to happen after Joshua has died. Note when Joshua was alive and leading them, they all worked in unity. All the tribes would gather together to achieve a common goal. And after Joshua dies, the tribes begin fragmenting and begin to make alliances with some of one another, but not all. And so it's no wonder that they're significantly weaker and less able to accomplish the work they've given to do, because they weren't really meant to go all by themselves. But that's what they try. Verse 22, the descendants of Joseph attacked the town of Bethel, and the Lord was with them. They sent men to scout out Bethel, formerly known as Luz, and they confronted a man coming out of the town and said to him, "Show us a way into the town, and we will have mercy on you." So he showed them a way in, and they killed everyone in the town except that man and his family. Later, the man moved to the land of Hittites, where he built a town. He named it Luz, which is its name to this day. So the tribe of Manasseh failed to drive out the people living in Bethshan, Tanakh, Dor, Iblim, Megiddo, and all their surrounding settlements, because the Canaanites were determined to stay in that region. So the tribe of Manasseh, remember, is a half tribe. It's a lesser number of folks, and they really don't manage to take over any of the towns and the peoples that they were supposed to. But eventually in verse 28, they get stronger. And when they get stronger, they force the Canaanites to work as slaves, but they never did drive them completely out of the land. So I have this underlined because slavery is one of those things that comes up as people's reaction to the Bible and people's reaction to our God, as saying, well, how can you say God is good when God allowed for slavery, killing, and death? No, this isn't what they were supposed to do. This is what they chose to do because they could. How many of us choose to sin? We know it's not what we should do, might not be the best thing long term, but it feels good right now, and we choose to do it because we can. This is what the Israelites do. Verse 29, the tribe of Ephraim failed to drive out the Canaanites living in Gezer, so the Canaanites continued to live there among them. The tribe of Zebulun failed to drive out the residents of Kitron and Nahalal, so the Canaanites continued to live among them, but the Canaanites were forced to work as slaves for the people of Zebulun. So here we have yet another tribe going, hey, we were kept as slaves in Egypt. Why don't we keep some slaves for us? We don't want to work that hard. We don't want to conquer the land for ourselves when we can make someone else work it. Verse 31, the tribe of Asher failed to drive out the residents of Akko, Sidon, Alab, Aksib, Helba, Afik, and Rehob. Instead, the people of Asher moved in among the Canaanites who controlled the land, for they failed to drive them out. Likewise, the tribe of Naphtali failed to drive out the residents of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath. Instead, they moved in among the Canaanites who controlled the land. Nevertheless, the people of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath were forced to work as slaves for the people of Naphtali. So they're not able to fully drive people out, but they are able to subjugate them. This is not really what was intended, but it's what they choose to do. And it's what they do because they are not working together as a unified people anymore. We can see this in our own lives whenever you at work or in your church end up with factions of people who have different goals, different visions. If you don't do something intentional to bring them together, you're really not able to work as effectively as you could otherwise, because you're working often at cross purposes, or you're failing to focus your labor potential on a common goal. And this is what they do. Verse 34, as for the tribe of Dan, the Amorites forced them back to the hill country and would not let them come down to the plains. The Amorites were determined to stay in Mount Heres, Ajalon, and Shalbim. But when the descendants of Joseph became stronger, they forced the Amorites to work as slaves. The boundary of the Amorites ran from Scorpion Pass to Selah and continued upward from there. So it really didn't take very long at all after the death of Joshua for the people to fragment. This is why leadership is so important. This is also why succession plans of leadership are so important. Moses had a plan for who would come after him. Joshua, not so much. One of the things that I do in church is I try and make systems and things that, such as if I were to get hit by a bus tomorrow, somebody else could step in and see what my goals were, what I was working on, and what I had accomplished, left undone, and at minimum, be able to figure out where the passwords were and all the critical stuff. We often fail to recognize that we won't always see everything to completion, but it is up to us to establish a possibility for everything to be seen through to completion. So now we go on to chapter 2, and we hear about the first angel of the Lord coming to kind of say, hey, what's going on here? The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said to the Israelites, I brought you out of Egypt into this land that I swore to give to your ancestors, and I said I would never break my covenant with you. For your part, you are not to make any covenants with the people living in this land. Instead, you were to destroy their altars, but you disobeyed my command. Why did you do this? So now I declare that I will no longer drive out the people living in your land. They will be thorns in your side, and their gods will be a constant temptation to you. Dun, dun, dun. So again, we begin to get a little more perspective of why is this happening? Again, God intended them to move forward with hearts set on worship, hearts set on obedience, and instead, we see hearts set on convenience. We see hearts set on having their own needs met and having their own lifestyle maintained, rather than seeking first to do the will of God. And what happens? Well, the very things that they didn't prioritize taking and removing will become the things that will most impact their future in the land. So verse 4, when the angel of the Lord finished speaking to all the Israelites, the people wept loudly. Nobody likes to get caught. Nobody likes to be reminded of what they were doing was wrong. But often when we are found out, when we do realize what's wrong, we are moved to repentance and we say, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And that's what happens. The people weep loudly, and then they offer sacrifices to the Lord. But as anyone who's ever raised children can attest, it's not enough to say, I'm sorry. The consequences for our actions often remain and must be lived out even when we are sorry. The criminal justice system is a testimony to this. You can be very sorry that your negligence caused someone's death, but you still have to pay a price and a penalty for it. And so now we hear in verse 6, after Joshua sent the people away, each of the tribes left to take possession of the land allotted to them, and the Israelites served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and the leaders who outlived him, those who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of Israel, died at the age of 110. They buried him in the land he had been allocated at Timnath Serah in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. So again, it looks like we're going backward in time here. We've talked about what they failed to do after the death of Joshua as a country, and now we're after the Lord's messenger gives clarity on why this happened. We're going to revisit, we're going to flash back, and we're going to carry the story forward with this new perspective of what they didn't do. Oftentimes, when we want to move forward, it's counterintuitive. The very thing we have to do is move backward and understand how we ended up where we are here before we can move forward. So we talk about Joshua's death again. And then we go on to verse 10. After that generation died, another generation grew up, who did not acknowledge the Lord or remember the mighty things that he had done for Israel. The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight and served the images of Baal. So we hear of a generation coming up who seemingly weren't told the stories. They weren't told the faith handed down to them from their ancestors, or at least they weren't told them in such a compelling way that they continued to impact the ways that they lived their lives. We often see this in the church where we have faithful grandparents or faithful parents, and then we have children who grow up and leave and go their own way. And for many of us, we're grieved when we see it. The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight and served the images of Baal. So let's put some accountability back, because again, the way this is written, it's just saying, oh, well, this new generation did wrong. Well, the generation that raised them did wrong as well, because there shouldn't have been images of Baal for them to worship. There shouldn't have been this intermingling. There shouldn't have been the availability to go so very far astray. But nevertheless, verse 12, they abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. They went after other gods, worshiping the gods of the people around them, and they angered the Lord. They abandoned the Lord to serve Baal and the images of Ashtoreth. This made the Lord burn with anger against Israel, so he handed them over to raiders who stole their possessions. He turned them over to their enemies all around, and they were no longer able to resist them. Every time Israel went out to battle, the Lord fought against them, causing them to be defeated, just as he had warned, and the people were in great distress. One of the things I hear very often as a priest is this question of, why would God let this happen? Why did these bad things happen? Why did God not protect us? And what we see here in Judges is that when the people travel outside the hedge of God's protection, when they travel any way and every way that they want to go, they find themselves having left the protection of God behind. All of us are vulnerable when we live our own way and don't seek to follow God. Also, I want to comment, for those of us growing up in a modern society, we are often semi-raised or have this cultural belief that, well, one God is another, and this whole, well, there's one mountain, but there's many paths to ascend to get to the height of relationship with God. And it's often presented as if all of these paths were equally valid, equally valuable, and equally likely to lead to a relationship with the true God. This is not what the Bible teaches. That being said, I want to offer the caveat. I don't believe that there's no possibility of salvation apart from Christianity or apart from Judaism. I do believe that there is, but it's still through the lens and through the generosity and the goodness of our God. But not all gods are the same. Not all religions are the same, and not all religious practices are healthy or helpful. Santeria, which involves the ritualistic killing of animals, is not something that is healthy for Christians to engage in and think, well, this is just fine. This is just another way for me to connect with God. Child sacrifice is not an acceptable way to connect with God. Self-harm practices that use a spiritualization of pain to move beyond and transcend is not an acceptable way to connect with God. There are just as many dangers to us today as there were for the Israelites then. You'll find lots of people promoting extreme fasting or extreme exercising or any number of I've even heard of people trying to stay up as long as possible, and that in that moment of sleep deprivation, they will somehow have an encounter with God. We have assured means of connecting with God, and we shouldn't seek after other people's means. Our means are through prayer. Our means are through petition. Our means are through worshiping our God and consuming the Eucharist. That's how we should be connecting. They were supposed to be connecting with God through their sacrifice and their times of prayer. But clearly, that was not as sexy or as fun as what all their neighbors were doing. So what happens? God allows the hedge of protection to be removed, and the people suffer. In verse 16, then the Lord raises up judges to rescue the Israelites from their attackers. Yet Israel did not listen to the judges, but prostituted themselves by worshiping other gods. So the role of a judge in the Israelite community was to be a rescuer and redeemer. We often in our modern world have a very negative reaction to judgment. I have heard many people firmly embedded in their life of sin say, well, you can't judge me because the Bible says, judge not lest you be judged. Okay, yes, the Bible does say we should remove the log from our own eye before removing the speck of our neighbor. But that does not mean that God does not raise up people, places, and things to hold us accountable and to judge where we have gone wrong and help guide us back on the path. We need people who help us evaluate our lives and rescue us from our own stupidity and help get us back on the right path. So if you are a person who is offering judgment in the spirit of rescue, that's not always a bad thing. But that doesn't mean they'll listen to you, doesn't mean they'll follow your advice, doesn't mean they'll come back on the right path. How quickly they turned away from the path of their ancestors who had walked in obedience to the Lord's commands. Again, the Bible's perspective is sometimes hilarious. This little verse, how quickly they turned away from their path when their ancestors had walked in such obedience to the Lord's command. Wait a second, are these the same ancestors who complained there wasn't water, complained there wasn't food, who, said, well, we don't want to go in the promised land because it looks hard? Yes, same ancestors. Again, our human perspective and the perspective of those writing the Bible is here. And so there has always been this temptation to view a previous generation as more faithful, more holy, better, pardon the grammar, gooder, and more worthy. And, it's these kids these days. But all of us are tied together in a transmission of the faith. And so if that transmission is broken, we share just as much accountability as those who don't live into it. But if you go to a church that sometimes says, for the old days when things were better, that's not new. It's right here in Judges, and not really helpful to them, but it's how they feel. Verse 20, so the Lord burned with anger against Israel, and he said, because these people have violated my commandment, which I made with their ancestors, and have ignored my commands, I will no longer drive out the nations that Joshua left unconquered when he died. I did this to test Israel, to see whether or not they would follow the ways of the Lord as their ancestors did. This is why the Lord left those nations in place. He did not quickly drive them out or allow Joshua to conquer them all. So in Judges, we begin to, again, reread with hindsight the past events given through this lens of new perspective. And they're saying, God didn't give us the victory fully because it was a test and we failed. So we now are reading about the nations that were left in Canaan. These are the nations that we've already talked about, but we're going to talk in more detail about how they led the Israelites astray. These are the nations that the Lord left in the land to test those Israelites who had not experienced the wars of Canaan. He did this to teach warfare to generations of Israelites who had no experience in battle. One of the things that we need to do when we read the Bible is put on critical thinking lenses. We always need to ask, is this proscriptive, meaning this is God saying, this is how this will happen, this is what happened, and this is what will happen? Or is this descriptive through the lens of a human author saying, well, this is what we think happened, and this is why we think God did this, and this is what we think we should do? I view this portion as descriptive because, again, we go back to that verse 20 and it says, so the Lord burned, and then it says he said, and there's quotes, as in this is exactly what God said. And now when we get to chapter 3, this is more of what I would say a priest or a pastor giving their interpretation of what God did or why God did it. That doesn't mean it's 100% true. Did God do this to teach warfare to generations of Israelites who had no experience in battle? No, because God just said, I did this to test whether they would follow the ways of the Lord. Has nothing to do with them learning battle in terms of conquering people, and has everything to do with them learning battle in terms of conquering their own hearts and their own desires. So these are the nations, the Philistines, those living under the 5 Philistine rulers, all the Canaanites, the Sidonians, and the Hivites, living in the mountains of Lebanon from Mount Baal Hermon to Lebo Hamath. These people were left to test the Israelites to see whether they would obey the commands the Lord had given to their ancestors through Moses. Aha! Again, this sort of mix of what do we want? Well, the Israelites wanted victory in battle and to take over the land because that would have been easier. But yet that's intermingled with the knowledge. They do know what it is. This is God testing to see their obedience. Verse 5, so the people of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, and they intermarried with them. Ding, ding, ding. I think both Joshua and Moses said, don't do that. Don't do that. You're going to make your life harder for no reason. For all of us as Christians, when we marry outside the faith, we've made our life harder. That doesn't mean it's impossible. That doesn't mean it can't be a good marriage. That doesn't mean that God won't use it and work through it. But it's a lot harder to walk faithfully in your own life of prayer and devotion if you don't have a spouse that's going to support and hold you up when you're weak and say, I know you're tired, but we really should go to church this Sunday, honey. That's a lot harder. And so they make their lives harder by intermarrying. Israelite sons married their daughters, and Israelite daughters were given in marriage to their sons, and the Israelites served their gods. So the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. They forgot about the Lord their God. They served the images of Baal and the Ashtoreth poles. Then the Lord burned with anger against Israel. He turned them over to King Cushan-Rishathaim of Aram Naharaim, and the Israelites served Cushan-Rishathaim for 8 years. But when, and I underlined this word when, the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, the Lord raised up a rescuer to save them. The annoying thing about our walk with God is often simply waiting and ready and able to help, but he's waiting for us to ask for it. He's waiting for us to find the humility to submit to it, and he's waiting for us to be ready to accept help. So God raises up a rescuer named Othniel, the son of Caleb's younger brother Kenaz. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he became Israel's judge. This is, again, a long-standing tradition of God that a younger son of a younger brother will often be the person who leads people back from going astray. And this is a subversion of their power dynamics. Because in their culture, the oldest had the most value, had the most wisdom, was the person who should lead just by rights of being old or wiser. And God says, yeah, look where that got you. Trusting in your own conventions is not going to help. And we should allow people to lead regardless of age, regardless of gender, regardless of whatever is going on, if they are the people who have the skills, the gifts, the talents, and the call to lead. And we're going to see this as we continue to work through Judges, because not only is God going to raise up a bunch of younger people and younger sons, God's also going to use women. There's going to be females who will do the work, because, again, often for restoration to happen, it is about right relationship and right leadership and relationship than it is about the right person. So verse 10, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he became Israel's judge. He went to war against King Cushan-Rishathaim of Aram, and the Lord gave Othniel victory over him. So there was peace in the land for 40 years. Then Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. Once again, we don't have a great succession plan, and the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. So the Lord gave King Eglon of Moab control over Israel because of their evil. Eglon enlisted the Ammonites and the Amalekites as allies, and they went out, defeated Israel, taking possession of Jericho, the city of palms, and the Israelites served Eglon of Moab for 18 years. And notice it gets longer and harder for them to cry out for help. Sometimes the deeper we go, the more stubborn we are. So verse 15, but when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, the Lord again raised up a rescuer to save them. His name was Ehud, son of Gera, a left-handed man of the tribe of Benjamin. What? Left-handed. This was culturally a no-no. This was unclean. This was not a good thing. And again, our God is a God of subversion. Our God is a God who overturns our own ways of thinking and says, look, what you think is most important, to have dignity, value, and honor, it doesn't mean what you think it does. And so God uses a left-handed man of the tribe of Benjamin. The Israelites sent Ehud to deliver their tribute money to the king of Eglon of Moab. So Ehud made a double-edged dagger that was about a foot long, and he strapped it to his right thigh, keeping it hidden under his clothing. He brought the tribute money to Eglon, who was very fat. After delivering the payment, Ehud started home with those who had helped carry the tribute. But when Ehud reached the stone idols near Gilgal, he turned back. He came to Eglon and said, I have a secret message for you. So the king commanded his servants, be quiet, and he sent them all out of the room. Again, Eglon is greedy. We know this because he's described as very fat. He is greedy, and he says, ooh, secret message? I want. So Ehud walked over to Eglon, who was sitting alone in a cool upstairs room, and Ehud said, I have a message for you. As King Eglon rose from his seat, Ehud reached with his left hand, pulled out the dagger, strapped to his right thigh, and plunged it into the king's belly. The dagger went so deep that the handle disappeared beneath the king's fat. Ew. So Ehud did not pull out the dagger, and the king's bowels emptied. Ugh. Then Ehud closed and locked the doors of the room and escaped down the latrine. Ugh. That's a lovely story and a lovely image, isn't it? I'm going to use a bad word, apologies, but you know, sometimes the only way to get out of the shit you're in is to keep going deeper. And this is what, Ehud does. And what he demonstrates is he's not proud. He's not ruling from a place of pride. And I'm such a wise person, I deserve all of these nice things or these nice treatment. He demonstrates real servant leadership mixed with an ounce of conniving. And sometimes that's just what God needs. And the reason he's able to get away with this is, again, because he's left-handed. The guards who searched him when he would have come in would have searched his left side, because if you're right-handed, you keep your armaments on your left side. And if he's the judge and a person of high value, clearly he can't be left-handed. So nobody would have thought to search him on the other side. So Ehud is gone. The king's servants return, find the doors to the room locked, and they think, well, he might be using the facilities. So they wait. And then they get concerned because they're still waiting. And so they go and they get a key. And when they open the doors, they find their master dead on the floor. But while the servants had been waiting, Ehud had made his escape, passing the stone idols on his way to Sarah. And when he arrived in the hill country of Ephraim, Ehud sounded a call to arms. Then he led a band of Israelites down from the hills. Follow me, he said, for the Lord has given you victory over Moab, your enemy. So they followed him, and the Israelites took control of the shallow crossings of the Jordan River across the Moab, preventing anyone from crossing. They attacked the Moabites and killed about 10,000 of their strongest and most able-bodied warriors. Not one of them escaped. So Moab was conquered by Israel that day, and there was peace in the land for 80 years. After Ehud, Shamgar, son of Anath, rescued Israel, he once killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. And we are going to end there for the day because I got to go pick my daughter up from camp. But I hope you enjoyed that lovely story and the imagery of crawling down a latrine. And use that in your own life for as you're going through whatever you're going through. Sometimes the way out is just keep going. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you again next week.